Welcome this morning to today's webinar. This is a joint webinar between Exabeam and Cyberseer, where we're looking at mitigating risk within your iManage deployment. So we're going to look at the challenges around iManage deployments. We're going to look at those scenarios and threats that can affect you, and then look at how our solution collaboration between Exabeam and Cyberseer actually addresses this and some of the features and benefits of that. And then, of course, one of the takeaways you're going to get is either a Just Eat voucher or a donation to NHS charities at the end of this. I'm Martin Cook. I'm the Strategy Director at Cyberseer, and with me I've got Sam Humphreys, a strategist at Exabeam. Sam, welcome along. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Good morning. Let's get the slides working. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you're joining us this morning because you are already a user of iManage, which is a fantastic document management system used throughout many organisations, very prolific in the legal sector. So important that the security at the legal organisations is kept to the same standard, at the very least, of the organisations whose data that they are holding and therefore on the hook for protecting. iManage is a great system. There are a lot of built-in capabilities or add-ons that can be used to help protect some of that data, but there are still a lot of gotchas that can affect the ability for attackers to access that information, or indeed malicious insiders. So we're going to take a look now at some of the scenarios and threats which can impact legal organisations. Okay, so just from the high level, I mean, these are common threats that affect the majority of organisations. Phishing is rife. We've seen a lot recently that phishing levels have gone up considerably in reaction to the current situation that we're in. Compromised credentials are still the #1 attacker behaviour that allows them access into networks. So not needing really to come up with some sort of great exploit. Once you've got credentials, if you can get into the system, there's a lot less kind of hacking needed to be able to get through and start having a look around, finding information, and indeed exfiltrating that data. Around 50% of attacks still do involve malware, and social engineering, I think will stay with us as long as there are people attached to computers.
And I think talking to the current pandemic that you mentioned there, Sam, using sort of a phishing email as a vehicle with something that seems familiar to people, that'll actually capture them and go, oh, this is interesting. Be it a sort of size of the pandemic now, or government advice, or guidance, or whatever comes through. People sometimes don't take that second moment to think, actually, is this important to me? Is this from a legitimate source? Obviously, click on it, and then obviously, like say, they'll gather compromised credentials, malware gets deployed, whatever it is. But they have that vehicle to get the attack in, and then go from there to actually gain access to whatever it is they need to do with those stolen credentials.
Absolutely, and I think that given lots of people are working from home at the moment, some not used to working from home. Also, we've got lots of distractions going on, be it being bombarded with news or our wonderful families around us. It's very easy, just in the heat of the moment, just to click on something accidentally, and we've seen many different sorts of new phishing emails come through, which are making use of the current situation. So, being vigilant is hard at the best of times, but when you're not inside the confines of the internal network and you're at home, it is easier to slip up and make an innocent mistake.
Absolutely.
Okay, insider threats are, whilst everybody's on the outside right now, insider threats are certainly a challenge. Be that due to malicious employees or ex-employees, careless or indeed curious or bored folks. The majority of law firms have seen some sort of insider threat incident happen in the last year. The report that these last two stats are coming from, if you're interested, is a law firm specific report done by Pricewaterhouse. So we can include that at the end. We can send that out to you if you're interested in reading it. But being able to spot insider threats with traditional technologies is nigh on impossible, because it is people who have got a valid login that are moving around the network. So your standard antivirus, or indeed some of the traditional SIM technologies, is very hard to spot that behavior. And then finally, you write some software, you have a vulnerability. There's, it's just one of those unfortunate things, is that the vast majority of software has vulnerabilities in it, and patching is hard. It's easy to sit there as a security professional in our ivory tower and say, thou shalt patch. But being able to get access to everything and make sure it's always up to date is complicated. And more so now, given that folks are working from home, they are probably, in many cases, using their own devices that you may not have control over. Again, I read a great quote the other day that talked about misconfigurations. If you provide the ability to misconfigure something in software, humans will do that. So you can have all the security controls in the world, but if they're not configured correctly, then they're not going to do you any good. Zoom has been a prime example of this recently. They've come under the spotlight a lot. And many of the configuration options in Zoom have been able to protect folks from some of those challenges that have been talked about widely in the press. Inflated privileges. Sorry, you want to say something, Martin?
No, sorry.
Okay. So on the note of privileges, a common problem since forever really is, if someone has challenges accessing an application, the quick and dirty way to be able to solve that often is just to give them admin rights, and those rights aren't always revoked. Handling that whole identity piece can be very, very difficult for an IT department, especially if you have a very small team. But again, that leaves you open to risk of people being able to access things that they're not really supposed to, which not only from a security point of view is important, but also from the compliance side. And then the final challenge being password reuse. Passwords are horrible. We can't remember individual passwords for every single thing that we access as humans. It's just not possible. So if you can use some form of two-factor authentication or password managers, that does solve a lot of those problems. But again, there's been multiple stories in the press in the last few weeks talking about passwords and account details being posted onto the dark web, where actually it wasn't that specific account initially. It's just that password's been reused by the user multiple times. They've been pwned in one sort of attack, and therefore it's then opened up all the rest of their accounts. So common challenges, which certainly will tie back to how you need to secure your document management systems.
Sure. And picking up on the point that Sam made just then, you can patch your environment, you can have the right configurations in place, but it's still not going to stop an attacker who's gained those credentials, they've compromised a user, or they're a malicious insider from gaining access. And really what we're looking at here is how you identify that normal activity from the abnormal activity. So Sam, if you could just expand these slides out to all four pieces. So we're talking about activity within the iManage solution for creating, modifying, exporting, deleting, whatever they're doing within that solution. How do you detect anomalous behavior in that sense? Because if somebody's exporting a large volume of data, then that could be normal behavior for them, or it could be anomalous, and they're trying to exfiltrate information for their own greater benefit at some other time. Same when we think about people accessing files. You can start to look at the behaviors of individuals and also their peer groups, their organizational groups, based on what their typical cadence is in terms of how many clients do they work with on a typical daily basis. Is that 5? Is that 10? Is that 15? Therefore, if they all of a sudden start to go for 50 or 60 files in a day, that's abnormal activity. Might be genuine at that time because of what they're working on, but at the same time could be anomalous behavior that's actually got a malicious intent. Looking at executive account sort of activity and understanding what they're doing. Is somebody using an executive account from a device they don't typically use? Are they doing something that is untoward? Maybe they've got extended permissions to see some of the sort of the more secure information about a client. How do you control that, and what do you do? And then obviously, where are they accessing from, the time of week, the location, and some of this has changed recently because of the sort of the working from home, and how you overcome that behaviourally is an interesting challenge that we'll talk about in a few moments. But really, it's if I've got credentials and access to a system, irrespective of what patch level it's on or security postures there, I'm going to be able to get the information I need because those credentials are king. They're going to allow me to get that information. So really what I want to do, if you go through the next couple of slides, is sort of, how do we use the solution and the service to actually spot these instances? And the first thing that we look at is data models. So a data model is basically, there's thousands of them across the system, but they are looking at individual attributes of a connection, of a transaction that's going on, and they're pulling out the activity. So this one here is looking at, for iManage, which is in the green at the top, this is activity per application. What it's doing is saying for this particular deployment, these are the activities that I've seen that actually occur within iManage. I can see I've got 9 different values in there. I've got 85 events over there, and I've got a confidence of 89%. What that confidence is really saying is I'm pretty confident that the next time I see an iManage related activity for this organization, it's going to be one of those 9, actually. Okay, if it's something else, then I'm actually going to surface that and say, hey, I've got an anomaly here or an exception. I've seen something else, and it'll flag that up. And obviously the analysts will be able to see what that is, actually look into it. Is it because of a system update? Is it a different way of working because of migrating to working from home, things like that? But ultimately it will do that. If we just click the slide again, Sam, please. And then what we've got here is another view looking at how users log on. So we've got a list of users that log on, the number of times that they log on, who's the most frequent, who's not. And we can say 151 values, 1,117 different events. So again, we're pretty confident that those 151 users are the users that typically use this system. Now, if we just click through the sort of the text on the right-hand side, what this does is it builds out for every user the activity that they do, the device they do it from, the time of day that they do it, any remote connections they've got coming in, all of that stuff is granularly traced within individual data models. Just click through the next 2, please, Sam. And these are compared as we go through new information coming in against these data models to say, okay, Martin Cook's logged in from a MacBook. Okay, he normally logs in from his MacBook. That's absolutely fine. He normally logs in from this IP. Yeah, that's absolutely fine as well. He normally logs in at 9 a.m. Oh, hang on a sec, it's 6:30 in the morning. That's an outlier outside of that normal time. So that individual shard of information may be raised as an anomaly for that particular user. And all of this is captured in sort of data insights tables for each user and for each system. If we just forward the slide on again, please, Sam. So this is looking at the applications for an individual user. In this instance, we've got the device ITH Osborne. This is Howard Osborne as a user. We can see the devices that he uses there. We can see the times of day and that he's active throughout the week on average. Each one of those blue lines is a login to a different application in terms of what we can see. We can see the ISP of the activity that he's using. We can also see the countries that he normally connects in from, so those remote connections where they come from. So we can see the moves between sort of Asia, Hong Kong, China, and the US there. And we can also see the list of applications that this user uses. On top of that, if you just click once more, please, Sam. We've got file access, so we can start to look granularly at, okay, so we've seen how he connects in. What we can now do is understand the file access for this particular user, the number of files that he pulls down, the size of the files, where he'll access them from in terms of the network zones that he's on, any deletes that he does within that. And you start to build through scores of these models. And I said there's many more in a typical data insight for a user. I've just picked a couple as an example, but they all come together to allow you to start to understand what normal behavior could look like for those users. So if we just go on to the next one, we've got a little timeline showing a normal user. So this is a normal user created for this webinar. But what we can see here is on the left-hand side, we've got time. So they're both happening at 4:10 there. We've got some web access that's occurring. And then underneath, we've got 7 lots of application activity. So this is looking at the iManage application, an example weekly progress report, and then we've got draft issued board report going out underneath. So, this is putting this into a session timeline for this user, saying at 4:10, that's local time for us. This could be a remote user, by the way, so the times will be slightly different for them. But it's building that timeline and saying that this is normal behavior for this user. There's no risk associated with this. So we can see the risk score of 0 as well. So if we go on to the next slide, we can look at what it would look like for a user who was acting anomalously. And what we see here, a different user is in Los Angeles. We've got a lot of contextual information at the top here. But actually starting at 6:48, we've got some remote access coming in. We can see first communication from the network zone coming in there. So that's given it 20 points of risk. That's anomalous. We've not seen this user coming in through this network zone before. And then we come down, we can see that they've read a file, patterns 021024, in terms of what they've got in there. We can see the destination of that file in terms of where the path is. We can see the user, we can see the office that they're in, and then we can see it's the first file access for this user. They've never accessed that before. First time from that network zone in the New York office. And then abnormal file access activity from the organization zone of the New York office. So we are apportioning risk points to that behavior that's there. Actually, if we scroll a little bit further down, we can see we've got web access going on there. And then we've got an email sent to this email address here, and we've got 26.2 megabytes in an outgoing email. We expect to see 2.1K typically for this user. And that's using those data models to say what is the average amount of time or average size of an email attachment that we expect to see for this user. There's 2.1K for what we've seen, and we've seen 26.2 meg. So whilst it's quite a small amount in terms of how big sort of data volumes can get, it's still outside the norm for this behavior, for this user. And this occurs for every user across the estate, irrespective of how they interact. The data models are unique for each user. So it's quite granular in the approach, and obviously it surfaces that information and makes it available in the timelines, which then feed into the service, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of moments. But before I do that, I was going to pass back to Sam, who's going to give us a little bit more information around the timelines.
Right, if we can all think happy thoughts about my web connection, that would be lovely. So I can, and hopefully it's not going to crash. Okay, just to note on the fact that we also show normal behaviours, because I think this is a nice point to make. When you're doing an investigation into something that looks like it may be a problem, especially when you're dealing with compromised credentials, it's altogether possible that you've got a user with those credentials that is the valid user doing normal things, as well as the attacker with the compromised credentials. So it just gives that extra color as to where we find things that look wrong, but also what we don't believe to be a problem. So I'll show you in a minute just the difference between doing this using the data modeling that's available in Exabeam Advanced Analytics, and I'll explain what that would look like if you were doing that manually, using that kind of query pivot approach, which is using one of the more traditional technologies. Let's have a look at the timeline. Okay, so this should hopefully run as a video. There we go. Okay, so here again, we've got an email come in for this user, Barbara. Barbara then got some malware, which in itself, that malware alert might sit normally in a queue waiting to get looked at. Barbara finishes her day. The next morning, there's a VPN login using Barbara's credentials, which is the first time it's come from Ukraine, first time it's come from this specific device. There's some risk transfer from previous sessions. We're seeing lots of anomalies now pop up that were not standard for Barbara's normal account behavior. There's been some remote access. And then finally, the person with the account has hit on this database server, which Barbara's never logged into before. What we pick up here is interesting. There's been an account switch over to SA, which Barbara's never needed to do that. She works in HR. She's never touched the SA account in her life. She's now logged into payroll. We can see a lot of information here about what's happened as part of that login. All of this data is available and pre-populated as part of the automation. She then goes to run a query on the payroll server. We can see even down to the query that she's run. I mean, that's quite a drastic query there. So select all from the payroll table, basically getting all of the payroll information back. That timeline finishes where she's now uploaded a lot of information back out. We've seen a trigger here. There's been a large amount of information been uploaded. And then finally, that last alert there about the abnormal amount of data, 559.2 gigs is no small amount. So pinning this stuff together, this is presented to the team automatically. This isn't something they've had to pin together themselves. They've gone into investigation. Risk score that you see there on the top right is so high, and they can see straight away these behaviors that have been happening and be able to drill into why they've been called out as risky behaviors. I just want to show you a separate timeline as well as to what this looks like if you're doing it manually. And Barbara's was quite complicated. There's been an account switch. She's had various alerts come through. There's been lots of different anomalies being picked up about the device she was using, where she was, how she connected in. Let's move over to Frederick Weber. Okay, this is Frederick's timeline. It is, there's not so much showing up here. There's a lot of normal behaviors going on. Eventually it will scroll down. You'll see here we've got some anomalous behaviors happening. All of a sudden, it's popped up in China. It's had some malware. And I think if we come down to the bottom, there's been a little bit of lateral movement going off. Lots of remote access to different servers, but no account switching. Fairly straightforward in the activities that have happened. Martin, pop quiz. How long do you think it would take you to do this manually if you were just querying into a log management system or just into data lake?
Great question. I mean, a lot of it is going to be based on the volume of data that's in there for that particular day or for those days that are on there. But, you know, it's not going to be one query that you're going to run, because you're going to say, you know, show me all the stuff for Frederick, and then you're going to have to piece that together in a timeline. There may be further queries that you do to go and look for other stuff. Maybe you've got a connection going out to something that's not being logged. You need to go and actually look for that. You're talking a handful of hours, I would say, to actually get something that's credible that you can stand behind and go, I believe this is as accurate version of the truth as we have based on the data that's there.
We had one of our guys look at this. One of our SCs used to work in a SOC. He was a senior analyst in that SOC, years of experience, and he went to recreate this exact timeline using manual queries. It took 96 queries, and that's from someone who knew what they were doing. He ran the test to see how long it would take to run those queries, analyze them, and piece this together. That one basic timeline was just over 20 hours of work for a senior analyst. Imagine doing that every single time there's some alert come through. The automation here really does start to speak for itself.
No, absolutely.
So how much? How do you piece this all together?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you know, technology-wise, you know, that's a fantastic sort of start to get you out of the blocks. Really, where this all fuses together quite nicely is when we start to look at sort of the people and the process within the Cyberseer service. And that's underpinned by something called Aspect. Now, Aspect, if we can just go to the next slide, allows us to collect the data that's being generated in Exabeam in this instance. And anything that is, what we didn't talk about actually was those risk points accumulate for each day. And if a user gets to a predefined limit, out of the box it's 90 risk points, then it automatically forwards the data into our Aspect solution from that perspective. There's obviously threat hunting. I'm going to cover that in a few moments' time as well, that our analysts also do, to look at those things that are below that 90 points of risk, or to delve into things if they're looking at investigating incidents. But the idea being that you take that telemetry, feed that into Aspect, automated security platform that's enriching cyber threats, and that's going to build out a contextualized version of information based on threat intelligence, based on a whole heap of other stuff that we've got on some of our own priority threat rules, and provide that to our analysts to actually make that informed decision. Now, that occurs 24/7. So what that means is not only has the analyst got a timeline view that's there, they've actually got a curated view of anything that is associated with that kind of behavior, from it being an indicator of compromise or related to MITRE attack, things along those lines, and they can make a head start, if you like, to actually respond to whatever it is that they're facing at that time. And that occurs across all of the data feeds that are coming in, not just iManage, in terms of what's in there. So if we just go to the next slide, please. So, 90 points of risk automatically goes in. For other things, from things like executive users, there's a slightly lower point that we look at as well, because obviously, a handful of risk points for an executive user could be more an indicator, a prelude to a more serious attack than, say, 90 points for a standard user, because they've potentially got keys to the kingdom or things along those lines. But if we're not responding to an alert in Aspect, what the guys are doing is they're carrying out some threat hunting. And what I've got here is a view, last 7 days, application events, vendor iManage, and the risk scores between 5 and 90 points. So this is covering that gap between something becoming notable and actually I need to go and do something, really trying to capture the activity earlier on in its life cycle. So if we just go on to the next slide for this piece. what we'll get back, and one of the nice things within Exabeam is you get back a view that actually looks at the individual users, as you can see here. You get a breakdown of the reasons that they've got risk score. You also get the events that are associated. So we can see for Barbara here, we've got application activity. But each one of these, you can go back to that timeline. So when we're talking about pulling that information together, it's 2 clicks to get to that timeline and actually view that information in and around all the other activity that may not be anomalous. It might be normal for a user to have, in Barbara's case, access to HR repositories, but they may be pulling information out of there to complement what you saw in terms of that, pulling out the payroll files and things like that. So collating the good and the sort of the indifferent data together in the timeline gives you the power to actually get that fully sort of transparent view of exactly what's occurring, make sense of it, and then obviously respond accordingly with that full fidelity view that's on there. So next slide. So let's say Aspect combines Exabeam's technology, our people and process, and our sort of tier 3 forensic analysts to give improved accuracy, greater speed in terms of detection, but also maintain a low cost in terms of the approach for it. So you're getting sort of the industry finest analysts with a leading technology that's bringing those together into Aspect and delivering out hopefully a low volume of high fidelity anomalies, threats that can be responded to and progress from there. So if we just take that a step further and look at what we have, so we can bring in log data from pretty much anything through into Data Lake, which is the log management repository of Exabeam. From there, we can go into the detection side, which is the advanced analytics piece that you saw with those session timelines and the risk points and the data models. The output from that goes into the automation platform Aspect, and that obviously serves up that contextualized, enriched view of the individual incident threats. They go over to the analysts in the next piece. For investigation, they may go back and do threat hunts. There may be enough information there for them to do what they need to do, and then finally that goes to your security team or your own SOC, however you want to run it from there, with scheduled reports, any sort of priority alerts, things along those lines. Benefits, it's advanced threat management. It's not a responsive waiting for a correlation rule to trigger. It's not reliant on patch management being bang up to date. It's looking at that anomaly detection, applying proactive threat hunting across the top of it to detect those threats early in their infancy and help reduce them turning into a more serious attack later on. Some of that's using smart people and sort of the automated platform, but ultimately it gives you that visibility across the estate, understanding behaviorally how your users operate. The service addresses your sort of skills gaps, so you don't have that concern about having to continually recruit, train, and then retain. But crucially, it's collapsing that dwell time between that initial infection and your detection of it, because a lot of these attacks that occur using valid credentials, they're hidden in plain sight. They're on the system. The dwell time is days, weeks, sometimes longer if you read some of the cases that are out there. So actually collapsing that down by detecting through anomalies is crucial to working that through. I think it's the final slide coming up.
Hang on. Connection. It's my clicking skills. There we go.
So with the technology and the service, you can identify how remote workers connect to the system. Obviously, that's key at the minute, but also understand any anomalies that occur across that. But crucially, protect those remote workers as well, in terms of making sure that if their accounts are compromised, that's detected early and then that's mitigated as soon as possible. There could be compromised credentials, there could be misuse. People legitimately do things believing, if you go to the next piece, sorry Sam, they carry out actions in the best of interest, but sometimes they get it wrong. We talked earlier on about if there's the ability to do something incorrectly, humans will do it. Unfortunately, that's the case with some things. So detecting that sort of anomalous change, if you like, and also detecting malicious insiders. And in the nub of it, that's what the service does 24/7 for our customers using this solution. So yeah, are there any questions? We've got a couple that have come in. First one, can I monitor just iManage? Sam, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
I mean, I've got an opinion for sure.
Yeah.
You could, but
I mean,
you'd be missing at that point. So
okay,
I think,
go on.
yeah. So I mean, one of the hardest challenges always with security is visibility. So one of the nice sides of the Exabeam solution that powers your service is ensuring that you can get all of your logs coming in with access to your cloud applications as well. I think with traditional solutions, it's often a trade-off as to what you manage or what you have visibility into. But yeah, you could choose to have a subset of logs coming through, but then you would have a lot of gaps. And the beauty of the timeline is to be able to pin together all those activities that are happening across the organization with those user accounts, so that you can see kind of start to finish across the attack chain what's been happening.
Absolutely, and I think, like you say, the more you bring in, the more data models are going to be created across that data set, which means the more chance of identifying anomalous behavior early, because you've got more trigger points. So it's not just connecting to iManage and doing stuff, but it's bringing in, maybe it's VPNing in from a new MacBook as opposed to my current one, or it's accessing, let's say, Office 365 in a different way. All of those things are going to be detected, and they're going to have associated risks with them if they are outside of normal data models, and that's going to allow you to detect much earlier than just monitoring one thing.
Yeah, agreed.
How long to deploy a service? I mean, there's a couple of ways on this, on-prem or cloud. I mean, I think the deployment side is subject to the size of the estate. There's a number of different things. There's sort of the cloud-based approach, which would be pretty much switch it on, and then it's about the ingestion. There's the on-premise, be it software or hardware approach, which is slightly a bit more of a build, but obviously the data is on-prem, so if you're not too sure about using cloud, there's that approach. And that's a couple of days to get stood up, but then obviously it's the ingesting of the data is probably the bit that takes the time, because you've got to be respectful for people's change management processes, and obviously configuration changes are possibly done by different people in different teams throughout the business. So somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks typically. Some are a lot quicker, some will take slightly longer, but really I think the way that has been successful for us in terms of working is to look at a phased approach and actually look at, okay, well, what is your sort of your critical event at the minute? What's the crocodile nearest the canoe? Let's focus on getting that in and making sure that we've got the surrounding data supporting that. So that might be VPN, that might be AD logs, things like that. And then, phase 2 will bring in other data sources to further complement that monitoring and enhance the sort of the visibility to go through that. But typically 4 to 6 weeks, thereabouts, is probably a good thing on there. Another question then, Sam. This is the last one I've actually got on here at the minute. Interesting. Do you offer MDR capabilities? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, can I say this? I've just written something about this, funnily enough. I think there's a lot of confusion over MSS, MSSP, MDR, and even if you go and look at things like our friends over at Gartner and Forrester, kind of their opinions on what those services really look like. MDR to me is always having that additional kind of proactive touch. I think this is not all MSSPs, but certainly some traditional MSSPs. There's a limitation in the service where kind of you correlate events or correlate alerts and then provide them back to the organization and be like, there are your problems, congratulations. Whereas I think the service that you guys provide really does have that extra touch to it. The proactive threat hunting, the additional advice that you can give around those alerts. To my mind, it's more of an MDR service. So managed detection and response, because you get that massive value add on top of say a different type of organization, which would be providing more of a kind of maybe a tier 1, tier 2 service. It's about the expertise and the value that you can add on top.
No, I'd agree. I think that's a very good sort of overview of that. Yeah, I mean, so that's the questions we got in this morning. Thank you for those. There's nothing else that's come in. If there are any further questions that people have got, please do email the marketing teams. You've got their contact details, and we'll get some responses out to you for those. But I mean, I think the last thing for me to say is, oh, hang on, so we've got a couple more that have just come in. Can I use the analytics service with the SIEM I already use? Absolutely. So the solution can take, from an advanced analytics point of view, the solution can take a feed from any of the main SIEMs that are out there and make use of that. So you haven't got to go and recreate the wheel deploying data lake if you've already got a log management solution, and you can get that view in exactly the same way with those timelines coming through from that point of view, that perspective. Rough cost is, I mean, it's based on number of users within the organization. So whereas sort of legacy SIEMs are EPS or number of devices, the approach adopted for this is to actually look typically at the number of users within the organization, and the cost is based on that approach there for the service and the sort of the licensing for the underlying technology as well. But if you're interested and want some more information, reach out, and we can certainly give you some indicative costs around that. I think that's fair, Sam. Yeah.
Yep, agreed.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions that we've got. So I mean, the last slide is basically just saying, thanks for joining, thanks for taking the time out of your day for this. Hopefully it's been useful, and we'd love to hear from you. So look forward to talking soon. Take care. Bye.
Good. Thank you.